Thank you very much. Thank you all for coming on this torrential day here. I'm going to do a couple of reading selections. Let me see. Find them. Nope. I want to read first about jobs. We have Privat d'Anglemont, who's the great flaneur of the 1850s, and he's talking about these kind of spaces that are sort of not quite legal residences, but they give shelter to a lot of people who wouldn't otherwise have shelter. And this is the ruins of a church destroyed during the Revolution, which he gave shelter to a population that owed fealty much more to the Kingdom of Bohemia and the Egyptian Empire than to the Republic. That is to say, its inhabitants included buskers, street singers, sword swallowers, egg balancers, acrobats, tooth pullers, and fire eaters. More than likely, its other tenants included practitioners of the short con, but the ones Privat lists are all trying for an honest living, however improvised. There were rag washers, doll dressers, makers of matches, of toy boxes, of toy parachutes, people who cut up rabbit fur to make felt, women who put wicks in lanterns, who unglued the silk of men's hats, who made funeral wreaths from hoof scrapings, people who abridged famous plays for use in puppet theaters. The jobs that people invented for themselves were one of Privat's preoccupations, and he collected hundreds of examples from all over the city. Madame Tibo swept jewelers' shops for no pay so that she could recuperate gold dust. Madame Vanard, widow of a perfumer, was a zesteuse. She picked up lemon rinds from the stalls of limonadiers and sold the zest to makers of curaçao, syrups, and essences. Old Monsieur Beaufils bought nightingales, canaries, and finches, and after educating them in song for 6 to 8 weeks, resold them for 4 times what he paid. The Meurt de Soif family, the name, apparently real, means dying of thirst, bought old suits, turned them inside out, restitched them, and resold them. Jacques Simon was awarded 2 goats by the government as a premium when his wife gave birth to triplets after previously producing twins. The mother and babies then died, but the goats multiplied, and Simon became a berger en chambre, which means an indoor shepherd, with a flock of 52 in a 6th-floor walk-up on Rue de l'Écosse. He sold milk from goats that were fed individual herb-based diets aimed at specific maladies the milk was intended to cure. Mademoiselle Rose, who inherited the job from her mother, was an ant farmer. She sold the eggs to pharmacists and to the Jardin des Plantes for pheasant chow. Monsieur Salier sold maggots. Mathieu Leblanc sold bespoke verses for all occasions. Monsieur Jaglet wrote little pocket guides to the law for the use of various professions, porters, laborers, concierges, etc. Monsieur Auguste collected stray legal papers and altered them to suit for people seeking admission to the courts of justice, which required something stamped and initialed. Maire Moscou rented out clothes. A shirt cost 20 centimes a week. There were men with noble titles rendered meaningless by the Revolution, but that nevertheless held snob appeal. Some of these men made a living acknowledging others' bastard children. But Privat mentions one who unexpectedly inherited a fortune and promptly lost it all to his elected heirs. A détripé was a professional witness who would collect information at the scene of a crime and become the event's leading witness. So that the court, the event's leading expert, so that the court would have no choice but to hire him. A réveilleuse, always a woman apparently, was in charge of waking others whose jobs demanded an early rise, especially at Les Halles. An ange gardien was engaged by upscale wine shops and cabarets to walk drunks home. A ribouille remade shoes, extending their lives by only about a week. The product was called 18, which is 18, which is a pun on deux fois neuf, which can mean twice new or twice nine. Les Halles employed many hundreds, from the famous forts, strongmen who wore distinctive sombreros and hoisted enormous baskets of produce, to people with very specific occupations: egg candlers, builders of vegetable pyramids, fatteners of pigeons, fish stall display artists, breakers of mutton heads to extract the brains and the tongue, whose workplace was called a massacre, a massacre. People who flattened ducks' breastbones with a rod to make them look plumper. There were many whose jobs involved some sort of counterfeiting. People who collected ham bones and jammed them into sundry cuts of meat. People who sprayed mouthfuls of fish oil on the surface of a bouillon to make it look fattier. People who painted turkey feet with varnish to disguise the progressive lightening in color that marks the days elapsed since death. And the confectioners of coxcombs, which were used in ragouts or as trimming, from beef, mutton, or veal palates. One of these told Privat that all combs are irregular. Look at mine, by contrast. If the roosters could see them, they'd all die of envy. See how mine are notched, carved, proportioned? They are perfect. When it came to food, not much went to waste. Bones were cycled 4 times over, from butchers to restaurants to vendors of cheap soup to gargotiers who peddled hot water-colored brown with carrots, burned onions, and caramel, and improved with the misting of fish oil. A boulanger au vieux, which might be translated as second-hand baker, collected stale bread, which could be sold as crumbs or for feeding animals. One of them allegedly figured out a way to restore the crumbs to flour, from which he made gingerbread for sale in the streets. Restaurant dishwashers could make a decent living selling not only bones and vegetable peels for various uses, but also the remains on diners' plates. These were collected by entrepreneurs called bijoutiers, jewelers, who used them to concoct a slum gullion called arlequin, motley, or hasard de la fourchette, luck of the fork, who had remained standard fare in the cheapest hash houses until around the middle of the 20th century. There were more purely sinister ways of extending the food supply, of course, such as the adulteration of bread, which might involve alum, boron, copper sulfate, also known as blue vitriol, carbonate of magnesium, carbonate of ammonia, carbonate of potassium, chalk, plaster, clay, or alabaster. In the 1870s, it was estimated that 40,000 Parisians did not eat every day. But, according to a police prefect of the time, even when they do not eat, they all take their coffee, which gives them strength. Recycling was fundamental to the economy, and there had always been people who carved out their own particular niches, such as the billboard stripper observed by Rétif de la Bretonne before the Revolution, who waited until the date of a performance had passed to collect all the playbills posted to the walls, selling individual bills by weight to the grocer, and those that were stuck together to the cardboard maker, and used as fuel the ones too filthy for resale. Place Maubert, on the left bank, from the late 19th century until the 1960s, the domain of the clochard, the bum, was the center of trade in second-hand tobacco, of which there were 2 grades: coarse, gleaned from cigar ends and pipe scrapings, and fine, twice as expensive, collected from cigarette butts. While the very poor might sometimes hunt and eat cats, the moderately poor were known to keep cats as pets. As soon as one died, though, its keeper skinned it, salted down its hide, and sold it to a maker of cat's fur mittens, which as late as the 1930s were sold in pharmacies and bought by Parisians whose rooms had no heat and who rubbed themselves with the mittens in winter in order to keep warm. Parisians long maintained a folkloric appreciation of their street trades, which were celebrated in such popular art media as broadsides, chinaware, and eventually postcards. The sidewalks and center strip of the Boulevard du Crime featured, in addition to its wrestlers, acrobats, and magicians, a profusion of vendors of water, eggs, greens, oysters, handkerchiefs, underwear, English pears, herbal teas, matches, rags, roast chestnuts, sausages, fried potatoes, apples, fowl, both living and cooked, and coconut water in the summer, and in the winter, oranges and mott, which were bricks of compressed coal dust that burned without flames, just smoke, which made them the fuel of the poor. Along the banks of the Seine, there were dog barbers, sailors' barbers, mattress carters, fish bait vendors, washerwomen, stevedores, and sand carriers and dray loaders and barrel rollers for hire. On Maubert, there were sock darners, birdseed vendors, public writers, confectioners of sugar pipes and little windmills with feathers as blades, gluers of paper bags and cones for grocers, and people who made the rounds trying to sell dubious objects they'd stolen or recovered from the trash. In courtyards and porte cochère, people sold newspapers, frites, and coffee. Everywhere there were buskers, acrobats, contortionists, street dentists, street jewelers, weightlifters, hurdy-gurdy players, snake handlers, flower girls, old clothes dealers, bill posters, lamplighters, glaziers, china menders, shoe repairers, knife grinders, silver polishers, window washers, carters and porters for hire, chimney sweeps, and vendors of ink, fish, potatoes, herbs, baskets, umbrellas, shoelaces, pencils, whips, rabbit pelts, licorice water, and lemon juice. Aside from those with marketable skills, many of these people were generally classed as Kamlo. The term means hawker or peddler, but in the eyes of a late 19th century police commissioner, a Kamlo was, by turns, a pickpocket, a pimp, a three-card Monte operator, an obscure informer for the Sûreté. His get-up is grotesquely affected, a wide-brimmed soft hat or a barely perceptible hat, or else a silk cap with an enormously high crown, brightly colored neckerchief, tight light-colored trousers, velvet or floral-patterned waistcoat with prominent watch chain. Certainly that avenue of enterprise attracted people who couldn't afford leisure, lacked the connections to obtain sinecures, or the inclination to join the artistic bohemia, but who demanded a certain budget of freedom in the use of their time. They corresponded to the original use of the term bohemian before it acquired artistic associations in the early 19th century, which referred to people who stood outside the social system and treated as porous the line between the law and the lawless. Louis Chevalier quotes a 1913 Guide des Plaisirs that takes the trouble to analyze the sorts of men who enjoy the favors of prostitutes without having to pay. Generally, that sort is not capable of regular attendance at a job in an office or a workshop, and anyway, he does not like bosses, so he becomes a Kamlo, or an itinerant of some sort, because he always chooses a task that will give him freedom in the open air, things of which he's often been deprived, and which he fears losing even for a day. Some only go to the racetrack, whether as mere players or as bookmakers. Others are dancers, acrobats, equerries, coachmen, automobile drivers, waiters, wrestlers, boxers, etc. So perhaps they were jailbirds, and maybe they were independent-minded, and certainly they were unconcerned with social proprieties. They had no particular desire to establish themselves as family men or ornaments of their community. But it's also more than likely that they were just following a path laid out for them by society since childhood. Skipping ahead. In the early years of the 20th century, the anarchists hunkered down. They only rarely put up posters anymore they claimed had been printed by the Imprimerie Nationale or the Ministry of State, but they still organized house moves à la cloche de bois, which means to skip out, literally by the wooden bell. They still held their meetings on the cheap by walking in on meetings of other political groups and simply hijacking the podium. But now the anarchists were younger, more ragtag, more personally troubled, less in public view, less grounded in tradition. Until his early death in 1908, their most visible spokesman was a man who called himself Albert Libertad, an orphan whom early illness had left with withered legs and who propelled himself on 2 crutches, which he could use as formidable battering instruments. He was generally accompanied by the sisters Armandine and Anna Mae, both of them his lovers, one or both of them his mothers of his sons, Minus and Diamant. He was a cynic, bitterly sarcastic, famous for haranguing priests in the pulpit during services at the Sacré-Cœur. Among his followers, according to Victor Méric, an early adherent, you found every sort, very studious quasi-intellectuals, poets, and also, necessarily, informants and provocateurs. And then there were the scientific types, confirmed in their ignorance, smart Alecs always on the hunt for some scheme. They were attempting to refashion the rules of life from its essential principles. Most were vegetarians, even vegans, végétaliens, and drank only water. They read Darwin and Huxley and sought a scientific rationale for an ideal existence freed from unthinking adherence to social norms. Quote, "The autonomous social cell bows to no law and no prejudice. The right to life justifies everything. The lives of others are no longer sacred for us. Only what matters to our I can have any value in our eyes. If in order to survive, I have to crush thousands of troglodytes, I'll do it with no remorse. If we have to cut down everything that surrounds us, let's not hesitate. As Émile Henry put it, there are no innocent victims. Let's hit hard, let's be strong. That is the true moral law of life, as biology teaches us. That's how to be a real revolutionary, nothing to do with the mystical and redundant babble of the workerist charlatans. It's galling to think that with no knowledge of anatomy or astronomy, nor psychology, nor zoology, nor embryology, idiots presume to address the social question. There was always, on every issue, someone with a more radical stance. If it was agreed that marriage was legalized prostitution and the family an incubator of misery, someone might say, cohabitation, that's our worst enemy. It can't be engaged in without compromise and consequent servitude. Anarchism must give the social cell, the individual, complete autonomy. It would be idle to abolish marriage only to substitute for it a bond that is equally as servile, for all that it isn't legalized. At the communal house in suburban Romainville, where the editorial offices of l'Anarchie were located, a sign on the door to the library read, "Idlers, crooks, drunks, stinkers, climbers, snobs, hysterics, eggheads, gas bags of every description. Do not pass through this door. Death awaits you." Painted on the library wall was a motto, "If you want to live, be your own best friend." It was from this milieu that the Bono Gang emerged. It was a misnomer from the start. Jules Bono was an excellent driver. He was a professional chauffeur who'd driven Arthur Conan Doyle and the prolific true crime hack H. Ashton Wolfe, among others, so he was a known quantity the press could latch onto, and he was also, at 35, by far the oldest, but he was really only a driver. The rest were all young working-class autodidacts, quite a number of them orphans, all of them laboring since age 12 or 13. Edouard Carouille, 28, a Belgian, had worked in a sugar refinery. Octave Garnier, 22, from Fontainebleau, was a baker. René Vallet, 21, from Verdun, was a locksmith and typesetter. André Soudy, 19, from near Orléans, was a grocery clerk. Eugène Dieudonné, 27, was a carpenter's apprentice from Nancy. Raymond Calmet, 21, called Raymond La Science, was a typesetter from Brussels. Élie Monnier, 22, called Simentov, was a peasant from the Pyrénées-Orientales. On December 11, 1911, a bank messenger was making his way down Rue Ordinaire in Montmartre, north of the hill, to the local branch of the Sûreté Nationale, carrying a bag containing 318,772 francs in securities and another bag with 5,266 francs in coins, while in an inner pocket of his coat, a wallet held 20,000 francs in banknotes and a bit of gold. He wore the uniform of his trade, a sky blue frock coat and a Napoleon hat. A car stopped and a man got out. Without a word, he shot the messenger twice and grabbed his bags, while a second man went through the messenger's pockets. The automobile took off. It was the world's first getaway car. The car was found abandoned the following day in Dieppe on the coast. As soon as the news hit the press, the bandits were seen everywhere in Europe. But at first nobody thought of the anarchists, although many lived just up the hill from the robbery. 2 days after the New Year, a 91-year-old rentier and his housekeeper were found murdered in the southeastern suburbs. Around 20,000 francs in securities and gold pieces were missing. Witnesses in the neighborhood who were shown photographs identified Garnier, and after his name appeared in the newspapers, the bank messenger who had survived also pegged him. In addition, he claimed to identify Dieudonné, who was irrefutably in Nancy on December 21st. The police tossed the Romainville house and arrested everybody there, then let everybody go, except Rirette Maître-Jean, 24, and Victor Lvovich Kibalchich, 21, despite the fact that they had no demonstrable connection with the case. Meanwhile, a crime wave had broken out. There were car thefts and robberies of stores, post offices, factories, and armories all over France and Belgium. The police were objects of widespread ridicule. On February 28th, a car running down Rue d'Amsterdam almost hit a bus, knocked over a woman, and then was blocked by the bus and had to stop. A traffic cop, who happened to be named Garnier, started writing a ticket, but the car took off with him clinging to the running board. He was shot 3 times from inside the car and died soon after. The police, in hot pursuit, hit a pedestrian and had to stop. The car vanished. Eyewitnesses identified the shooter as Garnier and the driver as Bono, with Calmet in the back. A wave of arrests swept up Dieudonné. Garnier wrote an open letter to the newspapers, taking responsibility and clearing him. A month later, 6 of the gang stole a car and killed the driver, then drove to Chantilly and raided the Société Générale. The employees resisted. One was killed. The bandits emptied the coffers to the tune of 47,555 francs. A witness pegged Soudy. Hysteria ensued, with denunciations and false leads galore. The prosecutor received as many as 700 letters a day. 13 associates of the gang were indicted. Soudy was arrested in a coastal town, Carouille in the suburbs, Calmet in Paris, loaded down with 3 Brownings. Bono got away from the cops and then, on April 22nd, was tracked down to a garage in Choisy-le-Roi in the southeastern suburbs. The police, who didn't know he was alone, called in reinforcements. Firemen, 2 companies of the Garde Républicaine, a cordon of volunteer sharpshooters. Taking in the scene were the Attorney General, a party of judges and VIPs, and a film crew from Pâté. The house was soon riddled with bullets, but Bono kept firing, so the police dragged in a cart loaded with explosives. After an initial misfire, there followed 2 explosions. Somehow the house was still standing, although there was no sign of life from within. The cops broke in, shielding themselves with mattresses, and found the mortally wounded Bono, also wrapped in mattresses. According to legend, he shot at them, although by that time he'd already put 2 bullets in his head. He died on his way to the hospital. A piece of paper was found in which he exonerated Dieudonné and 4 other people. It is said he died exclaiming, "Dieudonné is innocent." Newspapers pointed out that Bono alone, equipped with just 1 revolver with a 50-foot range, his other arm paralyzed from a wound received in a previous encounter with the police, had managed to hold at bay an army equipped with Lebel rifles and dynamite. Léo Blois wrote, "The newspapers are full of heroes. Everybody was heroic except Bono. The entire population, flouting laws, took up arms and fired away while shielding themselves. I confess that all my sympathy goes to the desperado giving his life in order to scare them, and I think that God will judge them more harshly." A few days later, Garnier and Vallet were tracked to the eastern suburb of Nogent-sur-Marne to a house in a densely populated area. Gendarmes, firemen, and Republican guards surrounded the house, while Zouaves stood on the viaduct above and rolled boulders down, aiming at the house. As riflemen fired from surrounding rooftops and bombs were thrown to no effect, spectators showed up, some in evening dress, some with picnic baskets. The gun battle went on for hours. Sometime after midnight, a huge explosion shook the house, and when the wall of smoke cleared, Garnier and Vallet were found dead in a pool of blood. In 1947, Léon Mallet wrote a novel, La Vie de Golas, which means life sucks, more or less, that featured a character loosely modeled on Garnier. As a teenage runaway, Mallet had been taken in by veterans of the Romainville commune, acquaintances of the gang who in the 1920s ran a vegan cooperative on Rue de Tolbiac. His character, Jean Frégé, a member of a revolutionary gang inspired by the teachings of a sinister oracle called Christ, is on the run from the police following a motorized caper. Along the way, he has met and fallen in love with Gloria, who doesn't know his true identity. He is itchy and paranoid, as well as jealous. Disturbed by Gloria's periodic absences, he follows her to the house of friends. The husband of the couple is a psychoanalyst who notes Frégé's anxieties and persuades him to unburden himself serially. During their second session, the women rush in from an adjoining room. The newspapers have reported that one of Frégé's comrades has given him up. Frégé takes out his revolver and holds the 3 captive, while the analyst coolly continues the session. "There's your penis," he says, pointing at the gun. "Your life has been nothing but one long, artful suicide." Twitching, unsure if he will kill the others or kill himself, Frégé says, "I would so much have liked to live," and rushes out. 2 weeks later, he bursts into a precinct house, on the point of death from starvation, but waving his gun and begging the cops to shoot him in the crotch. They oblige. 8 months elapsed before the surviving gang members went on trial. Carouille, Calmin, Soudi, Monnier, Dieudonné, Maître Jean, Kibalchich, and 7 other people faced charges ranging from murder to receiving stolen property and harboring fugitives. During their time in the Santé, 7 of the bandits were examined by Émile Michon, the prison psychologist, who questioned them on every possible topic. In the resulting book, with some probably lovely title, A Little of the Bandits' Soul, he never identifies them by name, with the sole exception of Kibalchich, because I, quote, "because I will never be able to consider him an evildoer." The result being that they become a blurry mass, bugs in a jar. Still, Michon's ambivalences add up to a convincing group portrait. They intellectualized their emotions. They were so invested in their I that they were often ignorant of the most basic facts about others. They were ascetics even in matters of the heart. They had excellent memories. Most of them could lecture endlessly on Spinoza, Lamarck, Schopenhauer, the sciences. They were slobs. Quote, "They seem to want to attach themselves to nothing, and they dread all discipline, even that of habit. They are inconstant in every sense of the word. They come and go, move, travel, are always leaving someone. When they arrive somewhere, they go away again almost immediately. They settle nowhere. Since they are always wanted for some infraction or violation, they change names as easily as they change addresses, and they sleep with one eye open. Extrapolating a bit from his account, you can figure that Monnier, from the Midi, was the warmest and most passionate. Raymond Lassiance, cold and pedantic. Carouille was stolid and slow. Dieudonné, earnest and deliberate. Jean de Boët, who got 10 years, was poetic and a gifted artist. Michon refers to only one of them as a psychopath. By process of elimination, that would leave Soudy, who had himself photographed aiming a rifle at the camera. Before even being sentenced, Carouille had bit down on a cyanide capsule he'd obtained somehow. 7, including Rirette Maître Jean and the 2 other women, were acquitted. 3 were sentenced to prison terms, including Kibalchich, who served as 5 years, then changed his name to Victor Serge. He fought in revolutions in Spain and Russia, was among the first to warn the West about Stalin, wrote extraordinary books. Dieudonné, despite all the efforts to exonerate him, was sentenced to death, and then the sentence was commuted to life in the penal colony. Soudy, Calmet, and Monnier all married the widow, that is, they went to the guillotine. On his way, Monnier said, "Farewell to you all, gentlemen, and to society as well." Calmet said, "It's a beautiful sight, isn't it? A man who's going to die." Soudy said, "Brr, it's cold." Calmet and Monnier left their bodies to science, Monnier to surgical anatomy, Calmet to biochemical research. His disembodied hands remain preserved in formaldehyde at the Medico-Legal Institute in Lille. Soudy left his brain to the dean of the medical faculty at the University of Paris, his burglary tools to the Ministry of War, his skull to the Museum of Anthropology that would be exhibited in the profits given to soup kitchens, his hair for the Barbers' Union to sell to benefit the cause, and his autograph to l'anarchie so that, quote, priests and apostles of philosophy can use it to further their cynical individualism. Instead, they buried him in Ivry. Thank you.
I think we have time for a few questions if you're open to that. Is anybody in the audience?
I'm open to questions, sure.
Have a question you'd like to ask?
How long was the research for this book?
Way too long.
Way too long.
Well, it was less than 10 years, but more than 5.
Wow.
But, also, I probably started researching this book not knowing what I was going to do with it when I was like a teenager. So, yeah. Sir.
When you started, were you focusing on a particular period, or did that expand, or did that stay pretty much?
Well, I was dowsing, and I was thinking of trying to limit it in some way, and it just spread like an ink blot, really. So that it's not chronological in succession in the book, but it ends up covering roughly from the fall of Napoleon until sometime in the 1970s, that is really, from the beginnings of modern France to, really the terminal point is the destruction of Les Halles, which irrevocably changed the face of Paris.
Any other questions? You just shout.
What role did the anarchists play in the commune?
The anarchists in the commune?
Yeah, the bohemians, the anarchists.
Well, that's a big question. First of all, there were anarchists in the commune, but the anarchist idea then was still kind of nascent. You know, there was Proudhon, who first person to call himself an anarchist. He was a big influence on the commune, but the split between Marx and Bakunin wasn't going to happen until 5 years after the fall of the commune. So it gets a little inside baseball, really, to figure this out. But let's say that, yes, the anarchists played an important part, even if they might not necessarily all been aware they were anarchists at the time.
One or two more?
Can you talk about the illustrations in the book, because they're so important?
Oh, yeah. So, well, you know, years ago I wrote this book called Low Life about New York City, and I didn't know anything about getting illustrations and how much they cost and rights and all that. And so I started researching illustrations after the book was done, and paid a lot of money to use basically other people's copies of things that were in the public domain, and then realized that, you know, you have to pay over and over again, you know, for paperback edition, etc. So, determined not to let this happen to me this time, I started collecting images as soon as I knew I was writing this book. So I collected many, many, many images from the pages of old newspapers, old books, from flea markets, eBay, etc. So I think, I don't have a final count, but I think there are 365 approximately pictures in here. And it's, you know, they, and I'm a little saddened that some of them are smaller than they should be. On the other hand, this was a brilliant design move on the part of the designer. It's kind of like, you have to think of it as, it's not a photo album. They're a bit more like the little pictures in the dictionary, you know, when you look up bulldog and there's a little quarter-inch picture of a bulldog. It's a bit like that. Some of them are a little murkier than they should be, but you know, it was really a lot of fun collecting these images. Postcards, sheet music, engravings by the great 19th century illustrators, Daumier and Granville and Steinlen, and who else? I'm forgetting some. Anyway, just, you know, I love these illustrators, some of whom, Granville, for example, I came to know when I was Barbara Epstein's assistant at the New York Review, and back in those days, she was handling the illustrations and used a lot of these same illustrators in their pages, and they're very eloquent, and they're, you know, some of these pictures are as applicable to today as they are to the 1840s or whenever they were produced. So it was, you know, so really this ended up being, I kept thinking I'll have like, well, they'll let me put in, you know, a portfolio of 50 illustrations. So I was really gratified that I was allowed to just stuff the book with pictures.
One final question, ma'am.
I imagine that you have a lot of time when you're low life, learn about New York, and now about Paris. Do you imagine yourself as kind of, I mean, there's rapscallions and criminals and, you know, of every major city, but are you kind of like, you know, sticking a thumb up to any kind of grand narratives of what we think of as New York or what we think of as Paris? And is that the story that you of why you're trying to tell them?
Well, yeah, you know, I mean, first of all, I do concentrate on the working class because that's where I come from. You know, my family, I mean, I'm the first person in my family to finish high school. You know, my father and my grandfather were both great readers and autodidacts, but they also left school just like the members of the Bono Gang at age 12 or 13. So, you know, if I have, you know, it's like belonging to an ethnic group or something. It's, you know, these are my people. And then too, in terms of sticking up for the forces of disorder, it was still possible to do that when I was a youth, and I'm, you know, heartbroken at this world where, it's you pretty much have to live in the tent in the woods in order to not be a slave of the corporations. So, yeah, I mean, if nothing else, I'd like to, give the message that those things were possible. Perhaps they shall be again someday. In any case, it's important to keep the flame alive.
Thank you so much for reading tonight.
Sure.